Well, I'm going to make just a real brief advertisement here. Those of you who've been around for a long time know about Alternative Christmas. We've had it for years and years. Our marketing department has produced the most beautiful Alternative Christmas material yet. As you know, these are powerful missions. Some of them are what we call our signature missions that we've designed. We know what the outcomes on those are. They change lives. Some of them are missions that we've adopted. Several of them address the needs of children worldwide. Some like Zoe Ministry, Compassion International. These are great Christmas gifts, and there is a alternative Christmas display out there where you can pick up your material, you get a homemade Christmas ornament, and then cards. It's a wonderful way of giving generously in this season and of recognizing and honoring people that you care about. Okay, this Advent season, I'm doing something I've never done. We're following the story of the birth of Jesus from the perspective of one person and one person only, and that is the mother Mary. We're staying entirely in the Gospel of Luke, although we're going to read today from 2 Peter as well. I want to show you how this works, the trajectory of these sermons. Last week, and you can get these sermons on audio podcast, go to our website or YouTube video, either one. Last Sunday, we talked about the visit. That's the visit of the angel Gabriel and the announcement that she would become the mother of the child Jesus. Today, we're going to talk about the waiting. That's the period of time that Mary was pregnant. And it's an important part of the story. Next week, we're going to cut out the last part of that period and talk about the journey to Bethlehem and how it simulates our own spiritual journeys. And then on Christmas Eve, we'll be talking about the birth of Jesus. All of these are going to follow the narrative in Luke, beginning today in Luke 1 and finishing in Luke 2. I think we're going to continue the series in January by staying in Luke and dealing with some texts we rarely talk about. The young Jesus, the infant Jesus, the circumcision, going to the temple, and all of that will stay in Luke. So let me encourage you to read Luke. It's our most readable gospel. The best stories are in Luke. And here's a simple challenge. Read Luke between now and Easter. You'll go all the way from the wonderful stories in Luke 1 and 2, the nativity, to the resurrection, and you could read just a few paragraphs a day and get it read by Easter. You'll go faster than that. You'll get it read in a few weeks probably, or in a few days maybe. But let's read Luke together. I think you'll find it to be really, really important and maybe even life-changing. Okay, today, the period of time of waiting. Mary, once she discovers that she is with child, she goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth. And when that story is told in Luke, she recites what is known as the Magnificat. It's a great speech. And we're not going to read that today because it's an important text. It deserves a sermon of its own. We're really just talking about the waiting, but we're just going to introduce that section where she goes to Elizabeth to introduce the part about waiting. Then we're going to read an important text from 2 Peter. So here we are, the 39th chapter, the 39th verse of Luke 1. In those days, Mary set out and went with haste to a Judean town in the hill country, where she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, Elizabeth is her cousin, Mary is young and should be barren. Elizabeth was old and barren until God brought a child to her, and she's pregnant now. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leaped in her womb. And Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit, and exclaiming with a loud cry, she said, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why has this happened to me, that the mother of my Lord," she already figures it out, you see, "that the mother of my Lord comes to me? For as soon as I heard the sound of your greeting, the child in my womb leaped for joy." Let me encourage you to finish reading this afternoon or this evening sometime. It's a wonderful story, and you'll read the Magnificat. Now we're going to read 2 Peter here. "But do not ignore this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like 1 day. The Lord is not slow about his promise, as some think of slowness, but is patient with you, not wanting any to perish, but all to come to repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. In other words, it will come without warning. And then the heavens will pass away with a loud noise, and the elements will be dissolved with fire, and the earth and everything that is done on it will be disclosed. Since all these things are to be dissolved in this way, what sort of persons ought you to be in leading lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set ablaze and dissolved, and the elements will melt with fire? But in accordance with his promise, we wait for new heavens and a new earth where righteousness is at home. Therefore, beloved, while you are waiting for these things, there's this theme of waiting, strive to be found by him at peace without spot or blemish, and regard the patience of our Lord as salvation. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Several years ago, I was invited to a dinner at my alma mater, Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas. I graduated in 1970. I've served on the Board of Trustees for almost a quarter of a century, and you've heard me talk about Southwestern quite a bit. It's a great school. It's a school that your children and grandchildren will want to go to attend, to get that great liberal arts education. I don't miss a chance to do a little marketing for them. It is a school that I've been proud to serve in so many ways through the years. As a member of the Board of Trustees, I was invited to attend this particular dinner, which was to honor the donors of Southwestern University. There are $1 million donors that we were honoring. I'm not any place near $1 million donor, but I'm a donor, and I was pleased to be a part of it. It was a black tie dinner held in Georgetown, Texas. We don't get many of those opportunities anymore, and so I went to my closet and pulled out my old tuxedo and dusted it off. It had been a while since I'd worn it. I tried it on. I was pleased to see that my old tuxedo still fit. And then for some reason, I made a decision at that point to do something I'd never done. I decided that rather than wearing the old black clip-on bow ties with my tuxedo that I'd worn for years and years and years, I would learn how to tie my own bow tie. We had a director of the youth choir at that time who always wore a bow tie. And a number of the youth in his choir had learned how to tie bow ties. That tradition has continued. You'll see some of our youth around here with bow ties. Chris Corson, Michael Kerner, and a number of other men in this church tie bow ties. And I thought, if they can do it, I can do it as well. So I went to the men's store. I bought a black bow tie. I came home and I went to the internet and I looked up, how do you tie a bow tie? And there are a lot of articles on it. But the neatest one is very cool. There's an article that tells you how to tie a bow tie, and then it also lets you print out instructions on how to tie a bow tie. And when you get these instructions, you look at them and you can't read it because it's made to be read in a mirror. So you fold this piece of paper and you stick it in your pocket, and you can look in the mirror and read it while you're tying your bow tie. Is that a great idea? So I got these instructions. Bow tie right over here. You're my hero, right? You got to have a bow tie. Jamie's father has a bow tie on this morning. So I practice and practice. I mean, every day I'd go in front of the mirror, put my little thing and practice tying my bow tie. The day came and Bobby and I drove down to Georgetown. We checked into the hotel. We got dressed. I put on my tux with the shirt, put my little cheater in my pocket, and tied my bow tie. I thought it looked darn good. We went to the dinner. For some reason, we were sitting at one of the two head tables. I probably was invited to give the invocation or something. I don't remember. But we were sitting with $1 million donors. And everything was going well until about halfway through the dinner. And I was sitting there, and I suddenly realized that something was going awry. I could feel my bow tie coming unraveled. It was excruciatingly painful. And I sat there for a while. I didn't know what to do. I made the mistake. I turned to my wife, Bobby. I poked her on the shoulder. I said, Bob's, how's it look? And she looked at me and she said, not good, Don. Not good at all. And so here we were. Here I was stuck at this head table with these distinguished guests, and there was nothing I could do about it. The bow tie was slowly coming unraveled. So there I sat for the rest of the dinner, another hour, looking like a drunk Charlie Chaplin. It was one of the worst experiences of my life, and it is an experience that I still remember today because of how emblematic it is in terms of how painful waiting can sometimes be. Have you ever thought about that? Waiting can be painful. I noticed that line in Peter. With the Lord, one day is like 1,000, what can be like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years can be like one day. Well, if you've got a 5 or 6 year old in your house these days, or a grandchild that's 5 or 6 years old, you know that with them, one day does feel like 1,000 years at this time of the season. How many more days is it before Christmas gets here? It is agonizing waiting for them. I started looking through the Bible. And this is what I discovered. I'd never really had this insight before. I started looking through the Bible, and I thought the Bible is really story upon story upon story about waiting. And it is almost always painful waiting. There is the story of Abraham and Sarah, for instance. You pick it up there in the 12th chapter of Genesis, I think it is. We keep going back to that story. It's so important in so many ways. And there is Sarah. She's old and barren. God has promised them that they're going to have a child, but they just keep getting older and older and older. And you can tell that the waiting becomes painful for Sarah. And then a few chapters over, there's the story about Jacob. Jacob is Abraham's grandson. And Jacob finds the woman of his dreams. He wants to marry her, but he gets tricked by his father-in-law to be by the woman's father, and he has to wait 7 years and wait another 7 years. It is agonizing as he waits over a decade to marry the woman he loves. The story of Moses and the chosen people in the wilderness, it's just 40 years of agonizing waiting. Go back and read the story. It is a gripping story in some ways. It can get kind of long and boring at places, but the story as a whole is a gripping story about the agonizing waiting of people who are trying to make it to the land that God has promised them. And then here in Luke, you open Luke, and in the first chapter you find the story of Mary, too young to be with child. And the story of Elizabeth, too old to be with child. And yet God has come into the lives of each of them, and now they're in this time of waiting. Can you imagine what the waiting was like for Mary? She lived in this little tiny village where everybody knew everybody. If you came from a small town, you get that. Walking around this village for 9 months with everybody pointing at her, talking behind her back. There she is, unmarried, with child, pregnant. Surely it was painful waiting. Elizabeth, a whole lifetime of painful waiting for God to bless her with a child. And here's the deal. The Bible is so honest. It tells us about life as it is. It tells us exactly the way life is for you and me. So much of our waiting is, in fact, painful waiting. You think about the person who went to the doctor last week, and the doctor says, oh, this doesn't look very good. We're going to need to do a CT scan. And don't worry, we'll get news to you right away. We'll let you know next Tuesday. It'll just be 8 days. And some of that, it's happened to some of you. 8 days of waiting to see whether there's a tumor that will take your life or not. How painful can you get? There's the person whose life has descended into depression. One of the worst diseases of our time. Depression, and they've descended into this kind of living hell, and they're waiting for the clouds to lift. They're waiting for this moment when they're going to ascend back into a normal life with some semblance of joy and meaning. But meanwhile, the waiting is painful. And we can go on, and you can think about your own stories of painful waiting, because believe me, you have them, don't you? You understand those stories about how life comes along and you've got a period of waiting, and it is not easy. It's painful waiting. That's what I love about the Bible. It tells us about the way life is, not the way we want life to be, and they lived happily ever after. There's not a single story in the Bible that goes, and they lived happily ever after. The stories in the Bible are real and true, and we know it because they never end that way. Painful waiting. But this is the other thing that I noticed as I started reading through the Bible and looking at these stories. Our times of waiting are also painful, but they are also pregnant. Pregnant waiting. That's what the story of Mary tells us. That in our times of waiting, when we invite God in, our times of waiting, even the painful times, are also pregnant times. In 1975, I was sent to be the pastor of First Methodist Church in Frisco, Texas. That's where I met my wife. I served Frisco from 75 to 80. Those of you that have been around for a few years will kind of get a kick out of this. The population of Frisco in those days was 1,800. That wasn't the size of my church. That was the size of the city of Frisco, 1,800. My mother and father-in-law were great people. They became like my own parents. And I remember one year while I was there, during this time of the year, I was preaching about Mary, and I talked about Mary being pregnant. And later, after that, we went to lunch, and my mother-in-law, Mary, and she was very gentle about this, but she said, you know, Don, really in the old days, we didn't use that word pregnant. You didn't use the word pregnant in polite company. It was considered to be kind of a vulgar term. Nobody in the old days would have said the word pregnant from the pulpit. And I said, well, Mary, what should I say? She said, the polite way of talking about Mary would have been to say, or any other one would have been to say that she was with child. Obviously, this made a big impression on me. You know, my mother-in-law kind of straightened me out about this. She was with child, and I've always thought about it. But let me tell you, she was wrong. To say that a woman is with child is different from saying that a person is pregnant, full of possibility, full of life, growing to the point that life will burst forth. Isn't that a powerful and beautiful and godlike word? Pregnant. Every year at this time, I think about this great saying, this great line from the great Boris Pasternak. He said, when a woman becomes pregnant, she is never again the same, because now she is ruled by that life that lives inside of her. One of the greatest lines ever written, I think. When a woman becomes pregnant, she is never again the same, because now she is ruled by that life that lives within her. Isn't it true that we would all love to be pregnant with God's love? To be pregnant with the gift of God's life? To be pregnant with the possibility of hope and joy and peace? There is this understanding about how life works it's fairly persistent, at least since 1901. Freud published his theory of dreams in 1901. At least since Freud, there's been this understanding about life, and this is the way I would kind of describe it in a simple way, and that is that past is future, or that past is destiny. And you know this understanding. It's the belief that what has happened to a person in the past will determine who they will be in the future. It's the belief that somehow a person that was terribly abused in the past is forevermore, without a doubt, going to somehow be wounded for the rest of their lives. That who you were and what you were in the past determines who you are and what you will be in the future. That past is destiny. Let me tell you, that is absolutely wrong. From the Christian perspective, we believe in just the opposite. That the gospel of Jesus Christ tells us that what is yet to be is more important than what has already been. The good news of Jesus tells us that it is what God has planted in us, that it is what is yet to be that will determine what life will be for us. That we are free to choose to live with God, and that we are free to choose to invite God in. We are the children of God, pregnant with all sorts of possibilities for life and joy and hope. What could be better news for you and me than for us to be able to proclaim with one voice, we are pregnant with God?